Hesitation. She simply shouldered her rifle once more, her movements as quiet and deliberate as before. The range went silent again, soldiers holding their breath, watching as the weight of the challenge settled over her. Her first shot cracked out, the sound rolling across the hot air. A split second later, ping. The 600-yard plate rang clear. She worked the bolt without pause, chambering the next round. The second shot followed, clean and sharp. Ping. The 800-yard plate shuddered under the strike. Now came the true test. The farthest plate. Crosswinds swept across the field again, banners flapping violently. Even the SEAL officer narrowed his eyes as if silently daring her to miss. She adjusted her stance, exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. Crack. The silence that followed was unbearable, a held breath from dozens of men. Then, ping. The final plate sang with the unmistakable tone of steel struck dead on. 3 shots. 3 hits. No misses. The men erupted, not with cheers but with disbelief. Some cursed aloud, others shook their heads. A few stepped back, staring at her as though they were witnessing something unnatural. The officer's face turned red, veins standing out along his temple. His authority slipped further with every murmured voice questioning what they had just seen. She, however, lowered the rifle gently and rested it against her leg, her expression unchanged. It wasn't triumph that shone in her eyes, but quiet certainty. She had known she could do it. There had never been doubt in her mind. Finally, the officer spat the words out, his tone sharp, almost desperate. "Who are you?" It wasn't just curiosity, it was frustration, a demand for explanation. He couldn't reconcile the image before him. A simple woman with a rifle older than most of the men on the field, out shooting him and everyone else with ease. She looked at him for a long moment, then answered simply. Just someone who learned that skill comes from discipline, not from what's in your hands. Her voice was steady, soft even, but the weight of it carried across the range. It was a truth none of them could deny. The soldiers were silent, their respect shifting almost visibly. Where once they had looked to the SEAL officer with unquestioning admiration, now their eyes flicked toward her with a different kind of awe. The kind that couldn't be commanded or demanded, only earned. The officer clenched his fists at his sides, his pride warring with the evidence laid bare before him. He wanted to challenge her again, to push harder, but something in the set of her shoulders told him it wouldn't matter. Every challenge he threw she would meet. And she would meet it without fanfare, without arrogance, with nothing but skill. And that, more than anything, terrified him. The SEAL officer's pride, already bleeding from the first humiliation, now burned with a heat that matched the desert sun overhead. His men weren't supposed to look at anyone else with that kind of respect, especially not at her. He could feel it slipping, the fragile authority that held their attention, their loyalty. It wasn't just about marksmanship anymore. This was about who commanded the moment, who defined the unspoken hierarchy that governed every soldier's instincts. And right now, she had claimed it with nothing more than steady breathing, iron sights, and 3 flawless pings of steel. His jaw clenched tight, teeth grinding, and then he barked out, "Enough standing around. If you think you're the best shot here, prove it head to head. Against me." The words landed heavy. A ripple of tension spread through the group of men. Some glanced at each other nervously, others smirked as though relieved. This was the moment their officer would put her back in her place. But deep down none of them were truly sure. They had seen her skill with their own eyes. The woman looked at him, expression unreadable, and simply inclined her head. She didn't need to posture or argue. The quiet acceptance of his challenge was answer enough. She picked up her rifle and walked back to her lane. The officer slung his modern precision rifle over his shoulder and checked the optics, his movements sharp and almost theatrical, as though the very act of preparing was a performance meant to restore the faith of his men. The contest was set quickly. 5 targets, different distances, each one painted white so that every hit would be visible. The rules were simple. First to clear all 5 targets with clean shots would be the winner. The men gathered in a semicircle, eager to watch what promised to be a clash of skill and pride. The officer smirked as he looked at her rifle again. "Don't blink," he said coldly, "or you'll miss the lesson." But when she met his gaze, her calm eyes gave no sign of intimidation. If anything, they unnerved him further. The signal was given. Both raised their rifles. The officer's weapon barked first, his modern scope locking onto the closest target in a heartbeat. His round struck clean, shattering the white paint off the steel plate. He racked his bolt with fluid precision, swinging to the second. At almost the exact same moment, her rifle cracked. Sharp, raw, unfiltered. The nearest plate sang back in response, a perfect strike. She chambered her next round with deliberate calm, no wasted motion. By the time he struck his second target, she struck hers. Each time his sleek weapon fired, hers echoed right after, like a shadow chasing him, refusing to fall behind. The crowd murmured, their tension building with every synchronized report. Third target. Fourth. The officer was fast, but she was precise, and the gap between them never widened. Sweat began to bead at his temple. He wasn't used to this, someone keeping pace with him, especially not with a relic like hers. Finally, both swung their rifles toward the last plate. The 1,000-yard challenge. The one that separated the amateurs from the true marksmen. Crosswinds gusted again, dust whipping across the range. He adjusted his scope furiously, his finger tightening on the trigger. She meanwhile stilled. Her breath slowed. Time stretched long and thin. Then, crack. 2 shots rang almost as one. For an instant, silence. Then, ping, ping. Both plates struck nearly simultaneously, steel ringing with twin confirmation. The men erupted in disbelief, their voices rising in overlapping waves. No way, they both hit it, at the same time. The officer's jaw dropped slightly before he caught himself, snapping the bolt back sharply as though the violence of the motion would erase the reality. But the truth was there, she hadn't just kept up with him. She had matched him shot for shot, every single step of the way. His victory had been stolen before it could even take shape. He turned to her, desperate to salvage the moment. You got lucky. The wind shifted and you guessed right. That's all. But even as he said it, his words rang hollow. His men weren't nodding this time. They weren't rallying to him. Their eyes stayed on her, wide with something bordering on reverence. She didn't gloat, didn't smile, didn't even acknowledge his accusation. She simply lowered her rifle again, resting it against her leg. Her silence was louder than any boast could have been. It was the silence of someone who had nothing left to prove. For the officer, that silence was unbearable. His pride demanded escalation, something bigger, something that couldn't be brushed aside by her calm skill. He stepped forward, his boots grinding against gravel, and snapped, "Then let's raise the stakes. No static targets. Moving once. You and me side by side." His voice was louder now, harsher, almost pleading for his men to hear his authority in it. But the woman only tilted her head slightly, then gave the faintest nod. She wasn't chasing him, wasn't trying to outshine him. Yet she accepted again, and that acceptance was what cut deepest. Because it meant she already knew how it would end. The crew working the range set up the next challenge with a kind of quiet excitement, as though they sensed they were about to witness something rare. Steel silhouettes mounted on rails were arranged across the field, programmed to dart left and right at unpredictable speeds. Some would pause, some would slide smoothly, others would jerk suddenly as if simulating live combat movements. For any shooter, even seasoned ones, this test demanded absolute precision, speed, and anticipation. Missing even once could mean the difference between victory and humiliation. The SEAL officer inspected the field with narrowed eyes, adjusting the dials on his rifle's scope as though preparing for war. His jaw was tight, his breathing shallow. He needed this. He needed her to fail in front of everyone, to restore the natural order that had been shaken to its core. She, on the other hand, walked toward her lane without a word. The rifle was already in her hands, cradled not as a weapon but as something familiar, trusted. She didn't fidget with it, didn't check her sights a dozen times, didn't mutter calculations. She simply stood, steady and still, watching the wind tug at the dust and flags. Her calm unnerved the men more than anything. One of them whispered, "Does she even feel pressure?" Another answered softly, "She doesn't need to. She knows what she's doing." Their words carried, though not loud enough for the officer to admit he heard them. Still, each murmur stung his pride like a wasp. The signal was given. Targets began to move in sudden jerks and glides, steel catching flashes of sunlight. The officer snapped his rifle up immediately, tracking the first silhouette with practiced efficiency. His shot barked out and the plate jolted with impact. A cheer rose from his men. He shifted quickly to the next, breath steady, scope adjusting. Another crack, another hit. For the first few moments, it seemed he had regained control. His shots were crisp, his speed deadly, each silhouette ringing with sharp pings. He looked like the professional they knew, the man who had led them through training and drills with authority. But then her rifle spoke. Her first shot wasn't rushed. The crack rang through the air, raw and unpolished compared to the officer's weapon, but the result was the same. A moving silhouette shuddered as the round slammed into its center. The soldiers glanced up. She fired again. Another hit. The cadence of her shots was slower, almost unhurried, but none missed. Where the officer raced to stay ahead of the targets, his movements sharp and aggressive, hers were smooth, fluid, almost graceful. She tracked with her whole body, not just her arms, as though she was dancing with the motion rather than chasing it. By the time the officer struck his fifth target, she struck her fifth as well. He was faster, yes, but he began to notice something that made his stomach tighten. He was working harder than he should. Each shot demanded adjustment, compensation, correction. His scope needed constant recalibration as the silhouette slid across the rails. Sweat built at his temple, dripping down his cheek. His teeth ground against each other as he squeezed off another round. Mississippi. The sound of a bullet striking dirt instead of steel echoed like a slap. He cursed under his breath, snapping the bolt harder than necessary. Another shot. This one landed. Her rifle cracked again. Ping. She hadn't missed once. The murmurs grew louder behind them, men whispering with awe and disbelief. The officer's chest tightened as though the whispers themselves were pressing against him, suffocating. He struck another target, then another, but every time he faltered, every time his bullet strayed wide, her shot answered with flawless precision. She wasn't rushing, wasn't even straining. She was steady, deliberate, consistent, and it was that consistency that broke him more than anything else. She wasn't just beating him. She was dismantling him, calmly, quietly, without raising her voice or boasting a single word. By the time the last silhouette froze into place, the results were undeniable. He had hit most of his targets, but his misses hung in the air like heavy smoke. She, on the other hand, lowered her rifle after her final shot with the same composed expression she had worn from the start. Every target on her lane bore a clean, dark mark dead in the center. She hadn't missed once. The range went silent again. The men who had once mocked her now stared as though they were seeing something almost impossible. Respect hung in the air, palpable, shifting away from the officer no matter how hard he tried to hold onto it. His fists clenched around his rifle, his knuckles white, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. He wanted to accuse her of cheating, wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, but the truth was written plainly across the steel plates. There was no excuse. She had won and everyone knew it. Finally, one of the younger soldiers broke the silence. "She's incredible," he whispered, awe dripping from every syllable. Another added, "That wasn't luck. Nobody does that." Their voices carried the respect the officer craved, but it wasn't his anymore. It belonged to her. She didn't bask in it, didn't even acknowledge it. She simply slung her rifle across her shoulder and stood there, the picture of quiet certainty. To her, this wasn't about humiliating him. It was simply about proving what skill really was, and it was killing him inside that she had done it without even trying to outshine him. The silence after the moving target challenge stretched heavy and unkind, the kind of silence that weighed on a man's chest and made every heartbeat sound louder than a drum. The SEAL officer stood rigid, his rifle still clenched in his hands, as though by gripping it tighter he could crush the reality of what had just happened. Around him, his men tried to hide their awe, their sidelong glances, the subtle shift in their posture. They no longer looked to him with the same certainty. They looked past him, toward her, the woman who had stepped onto their range with nothing but an old bolt-action rifle and left perfection stamped across every target. The longer the silence lasted, the more unbearable it became. His pride was being smothered in it. He could not end it here. Not after being matched shot for shot in the first duel, not after being outclassed on the moving targets. His reputation, his authority, his very identity as a soldier were bleeding out in front of his men. He needed to take control again, to create a challenge so brutal, so demanding, that she would have no choice but to fail. His voice broke the silence, loud and commanding, though it wavered beneath the surface. That was target practice. Nothing more. Real shooting is under pressure, when time and chaos don't give you a second chance. Let's see how you handle that. The soldiers perked up, some exchanging nervous glances. They knew their officer well enough to recognize the strain in his tone. He wasn't issuing this challenge out of calm leadership. He was grasping, clawing at something to salvage his pride. Still, none of them spoke against it. To oppose him would be to step out of line, and besides, curiosity burned in them too. Could she truly handle anything he threw at her? The officer barked out instructions, his voice snapping like whiplash. The range crew scrambled to set up a new course. This one was improvised, designed on the spot. Multiple stations spread across the field, each with a cluster of targets at varying distances. The shooter would have to sprint from one station to the next, firing on the move, making split-second judgments under the strain of time and fatigue. It was brutal, demanding not just accuracy but stamina, speed, and composure. Soldiers often left the course drenched in sweat, their lungs burning, their arms shaking. It was the kind of gauntlet where mistakes weren't just possible, they were inevitable. He turned to her, his eyes sharp, his jaw set. "We run it head to head. No breaks. First to clear every station wins. Let's see if you're still perfect when the clock's against you." His men nodded eagerly, some with hope, some with doubt, all with anticipation. If she faltered here even once, he could spin it as proof that her earlier success had been a fluke. But if she didn't? The woman regarded him for a long moment, her gaze steady and calm. Then, without a word, she slung the strap of her rifle across her shoulder and stepped into position at the starting line. There was no fire in her eyes, no visible hunger to beat him. Just the same composure she had carried since the beginning. Her silence was maddening to him, as though she was already certain of the outcome and didn't need to say a thing. The signal blast pierced the air. Both surged forward. The officer sprinted with the explosive energy of training drilled into muscle memory, his boots hammering against gravel, his body a blur of motion. He dropped to the first station, rifle snapping up, shots cracking in rapid succession. 3 targets fell in quick order, though one shot glanced the edge of a plate instead of striking center. He cursed under his breath and pushed on, sweat beginning to bead. She arrived seconds later, slower but composed. She raised her rifle, exhaled, fired. Crack, bing, crack, bing, crack, bing. 3 targets, 3 perfect hits, each one struck cleanly despite her measured pace. She rose and jogged to the next station, her movements steady, conserving energy instead of burning it recklessly. The officer pushed harder. His lungs strained, his arms beginning to tremble as he forced himself to keep speed. At the second station, his shots flew faster, more desperate. 2 struck clean, the third sailed wide. He swore aloud, chambering another round, firing again, wasting precious seconds. When he finally hit, he could already hear the sound of her rifle behind him, calm, deliberate, unerring. 3 more perfect strikes. Station by station, the gap between them didn't widen the way he hoped. He was faster, yes, but speed without precision meant nothing when every mistake cost him time. She was slower, but her shots never missed, her breathing never faltered. Her pace was a rhythm, her discipline an unbreakable chain that carried her forward. By the 4th station, sweat streamed down his face, his chest heaving, his hands beginning to shake. His shots grew sloppier, his frustration mounting with every wasted round. She, meanwhile, moved like a metronome, steady, efficient, unstoppable. By the time they reached the final station, the officer was half a step ahead, but his accuracy had abandoned him. His first shot missed, his second clipped the edge, his third finally landed. She arrived seconds later, raised her rifle, and dropped all 3 targets with flawless precision. The final pings echoed across the range, a sound that carried more weight than any cheer or curse. The course ended. The silence returned. And once again she stood unshaken, her rifle resting at her side, her breathing calm. He bent over slightly, hands on his knees, gasping for air, his pride bleeding out with every ragged breath. He had given everything, pushed himself to the edge, and she had beaten him without ever losing her composure. The officer's chest rose and fell in ragged rhythm, his body trembling with exhaustion, but it wasn't the fatigue that hollowed him out. It was the silence. That same suffocating silence that had followed each of her victories now pressed heavier than ever. His men weren't cheering him, weren't clapping him on the back or congratulating him for finishing first across the line. They were staring past him again, their eyes locked on her. A woman who hadn't broken a sweat, who stood there as calm as if she had just strolled across the range instead of running the gauntlet. She wasn't even breathing hard. Her composure made his ragged gasps sound louder, more desperate, like a drumbeat of humiliation echoing in his ears. He gritted his teeth and tried to straighten, tried to force his body into posture, but his legs quivered and his hands still trembled from the strain. One of the younger soldiers whispered, not quietly enough, "She didn't miss a single one." The words slashed deeper than any insult could. Another muttered, "She didn't even look tired." Their voices carried the awe that used to belong to him, the reverence that had always been his by default. Now it flowed toward her like a tide he couldn't stop. He felt it slipping through his fingers, all the respect and authority that years of training and deployment had earned, swept away in less than an hour by a woman with an old rifle. His pride screamed for him to lash out, to shout, to reclaim control with sheer force of will. But something inside him cracked instead. He had given everything on that course. He had pushed his body until his lungs burned and his muscles screamed, and still it hadn't been enough. She hadn't beaten him with luck, and she hadn't beaten him with speed. She had beaten him with discipline, the kind of steady, unbreakable discipline that no amount of expensive equipment or brute effort could replace. As he stood there, chest heaving, he realized it wasn't just that she had outshot him. It was that she had carried herself with a certainty he didn't understand, a certainty born not of arrogance but of mastery. And mastery didn't beg for respect. It commanded it. He looked at her, then really looked at her. The worn jacket, the calm eyes, the rifle older than most of the men here. There was no pride in her expression, no smugness at his defeat. She wasn't basking in their admiration, wasn't reveling in his humiliation. She simply existed in quiet certainty, the way a mountain doesn't boast of its height or a river of its strength. She had nothing to prove, and that realization cut deeper than any shot she had fired. For the first time since the contest began, he felt a strange stillness wash over him. His anger, his frustration, his pride, they were still there, burning, but beneath them something else stirred. Respect. Reluctant, begrudging, but undeniable. He straightened fully, his breath still uneven, and forced himself to meet her gaze. How? The word escaped before he could stop it, raw and stripped of authority. It wasn't a challenge this time, not an accusation. It was a question. A genuine one. Her answer came softly, steady as her aim. You rely on the rifle. I rely on myself. She paused, her eyes never leaving his. Skill isn't in the weapon. It's in the one holding it. The rifle only follows. Her words landed like a hammer blow, not just to him but to every man listening. They all shifted uneasily, their gazes falling toward the ground, because in that simple truth they saw the weight of their own assumptions laid bare. They had laughed at her, mocked her, dismissed her as nothing more than a woman with an outdated tool. Yet she had shown them that the weapon was never the measure of a warrior, discipline was. The officer swallowed hard, his throat tight. He wanted to argue, to push back, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down he knew she was right. His reliance on modern gear, on optics and speed, had made him careless. He had believed that his equipment and his title gave him superiority. But when stripped to the essence, when it came down to pure skill and composure, she had proven him wrong. Not once, not twice, but every single time. His men were silent, their respect visibly shifting, but now it wasn't just for her. They were looking at him too, waiting, watching to see how he would respond. His pride screamed to cling to authority, to find some excuse or command that would restore the old order. But another part of him, quieter but deeper, told him that doing so would only finish destroying him. True leadership wasn't about never losing. It was about recognizing when to respect strength in others. For the first time that day, the SEAL officer let out a breath that wasn't strained or angry. It was heavy, weary, but honest. He lowered his rifle, not in defeat but in acknowledgement. You've taught me something today, he said finally, his voice quieter than before but steadier. And I don't think I'll forget it. The words tasted bitter on his tongue but also freeing. Because in admitting them he shed the weight of denial. The men shifted again, surprised by the humility in their officer's voice. And the woman? She only gave a small nod, as though the acknowledgement wasn't a triumph but simply the natural order restored. She hadn't come here to humiliate him. She had come to show the truth, and in that truth there was nothing personal, only discipline. The weight of his own words hung in the air like smoke after a shot, drifting slowly across the faces of the men who had gathered to watch. They weren't used to hearing humility from their commanding officer. He was the one who always had the answers, the one who always set the pace, the one who stood taller because his reputation demanded it. And yet now, in the blistering heat of the range, they watched him lower his rifle and acknowledge a simple woman who had outshot him in every test. It unsettled them, but it also sparked something different, something deeper. For the first time, they saw him not just as a hardened SEAL officer, but as a man capable of admitting when another's skill outshined his own. That, in its own way, was a strength they hadn't seen before. The woman regarded him with the same calm expression she had worn all day, unflinching and unbothered by the weight of dozens of eyes. She gave no speech, no triumphant gloating, no demand for recognition. She simply nodded once, acknowledging his admission without fanfare. The simplicity of it struck the soldiers harder than any lecture could. Respect, they realized, wasn't seized by force or demanded by rank. It was earned quietly in the way one carried themselves when tested. And she had carried herself with such certainty that even their officer had been forced to bow his pride. The officer straightened slowly, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. His chest still rose and fell with heavy breaths, but something in his stance had shifted. The raw edge of pride that had fueled him all day was dulled now, tempered by something more grounded. He glanced at his men, seeing in their eyes not pity or doubt, but expectation, waiting to see what he would do next. In that moment he understood that this wasn't just about a contest anymore. It was about the kind of leader he wanted to be remembered as. A man who clung to pride until it destroyed him, or one who had the strength to learn when humbled. He turned back to her, his voice quieter but steady. "Show me." The soldiers blinked, confused. One of them muttered, "Show him, what?" But the meaning was clear enough. The officer wasn't challenging her this time. He was asking her to teach him. It was a moment none of them could have predicted, and the air grew thick with anticipation. The woman tilted her head slightly, considering him. Then, wordlessly, she stepped forward and gestured toward the firing line. What followed wasn't a contest. It was something closer to a lesson. She lifted her rifle and explained, not with arrogance but with quiet patience, how she read the wind, watching the way dust lifted and flags snapped, feeling it on her skin rather than relying on instruments. She showed him how she controlled her breathing, not forcing it but letting it guide the rhythm of her shots. She demonstrated how her cheek rested against the stock in the exact same spot every time, how consistency turned into precision, and how patience was more lethal than speed. At first the officer bristled. His pride still twitched at being the student, especially in front of his men. But the more he listened, the more he realized how much he had relied on shortcuts. On optics, on rapid adjustments, on gear that compensated for what he hadn't trained into muscle memory. She didn't need any of it because her foundation was flawless. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he let himself absorb what she said. He began to mimic her methods, awkward at first, but then smoother as he surrendered his ego. His men watched with rapt attention, some astonished, others inspired. The sight of their commanding officer learning from her sent a powerful message. If he could set aside his pride and seek improvement, what excuse did they have to cling to theirs? In the silence between shots, they realized they weren't just witnessing marksmanship. They were witnessing humility, the kind of humility that transforms soldiers into warriors worth following. The officer lined up a shot using her method. He slowed his breath, steadied his hands, felt the wind on his skin. When he fired, the crack was followed by the clear ring of steel at distance. He lowered the rifle, and for the first time that day, his expression softened into something not fueled by pride or frustration, but respect. He glanced at her, gave a small nod, and she returned it in silence. The men began to murmur again, but this time the tone was different. They weren't mocking, they weren't doubtful. They were inspired. A few whispered about trying the same breathing technique, others about watching the wind instead of just trusting the scope. The quiet ripples of realization spread among them like wildfire. What had begun as mockery of an old rifle had turned into a revelation about discipline and mastery, and it had changed not only their view of her, but of their own officer as well. For the first time since the contest began, the officer felt something settle in his chest. Not the restless, burning need to prove himself, but a steadier fire, the determination to grow, to refine, to become better than he was yesterday. Losing to her hadn't destroyed him. It had shown him where his limits truly were. And now, with those limits revealed, he could push beyond them. He turned to his men, his voice clear and commanding once more, but this time with a different weight. Learn from her. Every one of you. Because out there, on the battlefield, it won't be the fanciest weapon that saves your life. It'll be discipline. It'll be skill. And she's just shown us all what that really looks like. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was full of respect, full of something close to reverence. For her. For him. For the lesson they had all just witnessed. Word of what had happened on the range spread faster than wildfire through the camp. By nightfall, men who hadn't been there crowded around those who had, listening with wide eyes as the story was retold again and again. Each version grew more dramatic, but the heart of it never changed. A woman with an old rifle had humbled a SEAL officer and then taught him how to shoot with the kind of discipline most of them had never seen. For many of the younger recruits, it was the first time they realized that skill wasn't measured in rank or gear, but in mastery. For the veterans, it was a reminder of the humility they had long ago buried beneath pride. The officer sat quietly by the fire that evening, his body sore but his mind sharper than it had been in years. He replayed every moment of the day, every word she had spoken, every shot that had rung true. The humiliation he had felt hours earlier had softened into something else entirely, respect. More than that, it had become hunger. Hunger to refine himself, to return to fundamentals, to master what he had taken for granted. Pride had once blinded him, but now humility cleared his sight. He knew his men had seen him stumble, but he also knew they had seen him rise in a different way. Not as an untouchable figure of authority, but as a man willing to learn. That, he realized, was leadership in its purest form. Across the camp, the woman cleaned her rifle with the same deliberate patience she had shown all day. The weapon's metal caught the faint glow of the fire, gleaming not with modern polish but with the quiet dignity of years of use. She didn't bask in the attention her actions had drawn. She didn't seek out the admiration or the whispered reverence. To her, this was nothing extraordinary. It was simply the way of things: discipline, consistency, mastery. She hadn't come here to prove anyone wrong. She had come because the rifle and the art of wielding it demanded respect. And she would continue to give it whether the world watched or not. The officer approached her then, quieter than his men had ever seen him. He stood for a moment, watching as she worked, before speaking. "You've changed the way I see the rifle," he admitted. His voice was steady but carried a weight of sincerity that surprised even him. "And maybe more than that. You've reminded me that the weapon doesn't make the shooter. The shooter makes the weapon." She looked up, meeting his eyes with the same calm certainty she had worn since the morning. "You already knew that," she said simply. "You'd just forgotten." The words struck deep because they were true. Somewhere along the path of metals, deployments, and modern gear, he had lost sight of the foundation. He had relied too much on tools and not enough on himself. And now, in the simplest of contests, he had been reminded of the truth. He gave her a slow nod, gratitude shining in his expression where once there had been only arrogance. The following days on the range were different. The men no longer mocked her rifle. Instead, they studied it, studied her, studied the way she held herself. Some asked questions, others simply observed, but all of them absorbed the lesson that had been laid before them. The officer trained alongside them, no longer distant, no longer untouchable. He corrected their stances, then asked her to correct his. It became a rhythm, a cycle of learning that elevated them all. The pride that once had separated them as leader and followers was replaced by shared respect. Soon what had started as whispers became something more enduring. Soldiers began telling the story not just as a tale of a contest, but as a parable. "Respect the rifle, respect yourself," they'd say, repeating her lesson like a mantra. Even those who hadn't been there swore they could picture it. The officer humbled, the woman steady, the shots ringing true one after another. It became legend, a quiet legend, but one that carried more weight than the loudest boast. For the officer, the change was permanent. He carried his rifle differently now, not as a symbol of his superiority but as an extension of his discipline. In briefings and drills, his words carried a new kind of authority, not the brittle authority of pride, but the unshakable authority of a man who had faced truth and accepted it. His men followed him with renewed loyalty, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it in the fire of humility. And the woman? She remained as she always had been. Quiet, certain, steady. She never sought the limelight, never asked for recognition, never demanded respect. Yet she had it all the same, more than most who chased it endlessly. Her lesson lingered in the air long after she had gone, etched into the memory of every man who had witnessed it. The sound of her shots still echoed in their ears, not as noise but as truth. In time, when younger recruits asked about the most important lesson on the range, the older men would lean in and tell them the story. They would tell them of the day a SEAL officer scoffed and a simple woman proved him wrong. They would tell them of how pride was humbled, how discipline triumphed, and how respect was not seized but earned. And every time they told it, the story grew sharper, clearer, like the ring of a bullet striking steel across a silent field. What had begun as mockery had ended as legend. And legends, after all, are not built from pride. They are built from truth. The end.